HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Dark Angel, The Complete Tales of Jules de Grandin, Volume 3, by Seabury Quinn, read by Paul Woodson. Introduction, by George A. Vanderburg and Robert E. Weinberg. Weird Tales, the self-described unique magazine, and one of the most influential Golden Age pulp magazines in the first half of the 20th century, was home to a number of now well-recognized names, including Robert Bloch, August Derleth, Robert E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and Manly Wade Wellman. But among such stiff competition was another writer, more popular at the time than all of the aforementioned authors, and paid at a higher rate because of it. Over the course of 92 stories and a serialized novel, his most endearing character captivated pulp magazine readers for nearly 3 decades, during which time he received more front cover illustrations accompanying his stories than any of his fellow contributors. The writer's name was Seabury Quinn, and his character was the French occult detective Jules de Grandin. Perhaps you've never heard of de Grandin, his indefatigable assistant, Dr. Trowbridge, or the fictional town of Harrisonville, New Jersey. Perhaps you've never even heard of Seabury Quinn, or maybe only in passing, as a historical footnote in one of the many essays and reprinted collections of Quinn's now more revered contemporaries. Certainly de Grandin was not the first occult detective. Algernon Blackwood's John Silence, Hodgson's Thomas Carnacki, and Sax Rohmer's Morris Claw preceded him, nor was he the last, as Wellman's John Thunstone, Marjorie Lawrence's Miles Pennoyer, and Joseph Payne Brennan's Lucius Leffing all either overlapped with the end of de Grandin's run or followed him. And without a doubt de Grandin shares more than a passing resemblance to both Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, especially with his Dr. Watson-like sidekick, and Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot. Indeed, even if you were to seek out a de Grandin story, your options over the years would have been limited. Unlike Lovecraft, Smith, Wellman, Bloch, and other Weird Tales contributors, the publication history of the Jules de Grandin tales is spotty at best. In 1966, Arkham House printed roughly 2,000 copies of The Phantom Fighter, a selection of 10 early works. In the late 1970s, Popular Library published 6 paperback volumes of approximately 35 assorted tales, but they are now long out of print. In 2001, the specialty press, the battered Silicon Dispatch box, released an oversized 3-volume hardcover set of every de Grandin story, the first time all the stories had been collected, and while still in production, the set is unavailable to the general trade. So, given how obscure Quinn and his character might seem today, it's justifiably hard to understand how popular these stories originally were, or how frequently new ones were written. But let the numbers tell the tale. From October 1925, when the very first de Grandin story was released, to December 1933, a roughly 8-year span, de Grandin's stories appeared in an incredible 62 of the 96 issues that Weird Tales published, totaling well over 750,000 words. Letter after letter to the magazine's editor demanded further adventures from the supernatural detective. If Quinn loomed large in the mind of pulp readers during the magazine's heyday, then why has his name fallen on deaf ears since? Aside from the relative unavailability of his work, the truth is that Quinn has been successfully marginalized over the years by many critics, who have often dismissed him as simply a hack writer. The de Grandin stories are routinely criticized as being of little worth, and dismissed as unimportant to the development of weird fiction. A common argument, propped up by suspiciously circular reasoning, concludes that Quinn was not the most popular writer for Weird Tales, just the most prolific. These critics seem troubled that the same audience who read and appreciated the work of Lovecraft, Smith, and Howard could also enjoy the exploits of the French Ghostbuster. And while it would be far from the truth to suggest that the literary merits of the de Grandin stories exceed those of some of his contemporaries' tales, Quinn was a much more skillful writer and the adventures of his occult detective more enjoyable to read than most critics are willing to acknowledge. In the second half of the 20th century, as the literary value of some pulp fiction writers began to be reconsidered, Quinn proved to be the perfect whipping boy for early advocates attempting to destigmatize weird fiction. He was the hack author who churned out formulaic prose for a quick paycheck. Anticipating charges that a literary reassessment of Lovecraft would require reevaluating the entire genre along with him, an arbitrary line was quickly drawn in the sand, and as the standard-bearer of pulp fiction's popularity, the creator of Jules de Grandin found himself on the wrong side of that line. First and foremost, it must be understood that Quinn wrote to make money, and he was far from the archetypal starving artist. At the same time that his Jules de Grandin stories were running in Weird Tales, he had a similar series of detective stories publishing in Real Detective Tales. Quinn was writing 2 continuing series at once through the 1920s, composing approximately 25,000 words a month on a manual typewriter. Maintaining originality under such a grueling schedule would be difficult for any author, and even though the de Grandin stories follow a recognizable formula, Quinn still managed to produce one striking story after another. It should also be noted that the tendency to recycle plots and ideas for different markets was very similar to the writing practices of Weird Tales' other prolific and popular writer, Robert E. Howard, who is often excused for these habits rather than criticized for them. Throughout his many adventures, the distinctive French detective changed little. His penchant for amusingly French exclamations was a constant through all 93 works, as was his taste for cigars and brandy after, and sometimes before, a hard day's work, and his crime-solving styles and methods remained remarkably consistent. From time to time, some new skill or bit of knowledge was revealed to the reader, but in most other respects, the Jules de Grandin of The Horror on the Links was the same as the hero of the last story in the series, published 25 years later. He was a perfect example of the rare French blonde type, rather under medium height, but with a military erectness of carriage that made him look several inches taller than he really was. His light blue eyes were small and exceedingly deep-set, and would have been humorous had it not been for the curiously cold directness of their gaze. With his wide mouth, light mustache waxed at the ends in 2 perfectly horizontal points, and those twinkling, stock-taking eyes, he reminded me of an alert tomcat. Thus is de Grandin described by Dr. Trowbridge in the duo's first meeting in 1925. His personal history is dribbled throughout the stories. De Grandin was born and raised in France, attended medical school, became a prominent surgeon, and in the Great War served first as a medical officer, then as a member of the intelligence service. After the war, he traveled the world in the service of French intelligence. His age is never given, but it's generally assumed that the occult detective is in his early 40s. Samuel Trowbridge, on the other hand, is a typical conservative small-town doctor of the first half of the 20th century. As described by Quinn, he is a cross between an honest brother of George Bernard Shaw and former Chief Justice of the United States Charles Evans Hughes. Bald and bewhiskered, most, if not all, of his life was spent in the same town. Trowbridge is old-fashioned and somewhat conservative, a member of the Knights Templar, a vestryman in the Episcopal Church, and a staunch Republican. While the 2 men are dissimilar in many ways, they're also very much alike. Both are fine doctors and surgeons. Trowbridge might complain from time to time about de Grandin's wild adventures, but he always goes along with them. There is no thought, ever, of leaving de Grandin to fight his battles alone. More than any other trait, though, they are 2 men with one mission, and perhaps for that reason they remained friends for all of their 93 adventures and countless trials. The majority of Quinn's de Grandin stories take place in or near Harrisonville, New Jersey, a fictional community that rivals, with its fiends, hauntings, ghouls, werewolves, vampires, voodoo, witchcraft, and zombies, Lovecraft's own Arkham, Massachusetts. For more recent examples of a supernatural-infested community, one need look no further than the modern version of pulp fiction narratives, television. Buffy the Vampire Slayer's Sunnydale, California, and The Night Strangler's Seattle both reflect the structural needs of this type of supernatural narrative. Early in the series, de Grandin is presented as Trowbridge's temporary house guest, having traveled to the United States to study both medicine and modern police techniques. But Quinn quickly realized that the series was due for a long run, and recognized that too much globe-trotting would make the stories unwieldy. A familiar setting would be needed to keep the main focus of each tale on the events themselves. Harrisonville, a medium-sized town outside New York City, was completely imaginary, but served that purpose. Most of the de Grandin stories feature beautiful girls in peril. Quinn discovered early on that Farnsworth Wright, Weird Tales' editor from 1924 to 1940, believed nude women on the cover sold more copies, so when writing he was careful to always feature a scene that could translate to appropriately salacious artwork. Quinn also realized that his readers wanted adventures with love and romance as central themes, so even his most frightening tales were given happy endings, of a sort. And yet the de Grandin adventures are set apart from the stories they were published alongside by their often explicit and bloody content. Quinn predated the work of Clive Barker and the splatterpunk writers by approximately 50 years, but using his medical background, he wrote some truly terrifying horror stories. Tales like The House of Horror and The House Where Time Stood Still feature some of the most hideous descriptions of mutilated humans ever set down on paper. The victims of the Mad Doctor in The House of Horror in particular must rank near the top of the list of medical monstrosities in fiction. Another element that set Quinn's occult detective apart from others was his pioneering use of modern science in the fight against ancient superstitions. De Grandin fought vampires, werewolves, and even mummies in his many adventures, but oftentimes relied on the latest technology to save the day. The Frenchman put it best in a conversation with Dr. Trowbridge at the end of The Blood Flower. "And wasn't there some old legend to the effect that a werewolf could only be killed with a silver bullet?" "Ah, bah!" he replied with a laugh. "What did those old legend-mongers know of the power of modern firearms? When I did shoot that wolf-man, my friend, I had something more powerful than superstition in my hand. Morbleu, but I did shoot a hole in him large enough for him to have walked through." Quinn didn't completely abandon the use of holy water, ancient relics, and magical charms to defeat supernatural entities, but he made it clear that de Grandin understood that there was a place for modern technology as well as old folklore when it came to fighting monsters. Nor was de Grandin himself above using violence to fight his enemies. Oftentimes, the French occult investigator served as judge, jury, and executioner when dealing with madmen, deranged doctors, and evil masterminds. There was little mercy in his stories for those who used dark forces. While sex was heavily insinuated but rarely covered explicitly in the pulps, except in the most general of terms, Quinn again was willing to go where few other writers would dare. Sexual slavery, lesbianism, and even incest played roles in his writing over the years, challenging the moral values of the day. In the end, there's no denying that the de Grandin stories are pulp fiction. Many characters are little more than assorted clichés bundled together. De Grandin is a model hero, a French expert on the occult, and never at a loss when battling the most evil of monsters. Dr. Trowbridge remains the steadfast companion, much in the Dr. Watson tradition, always doubting but inevitably following his friend's advice. Quinn wrote for the masses, and he didn't spend pages describing landscapes when there was always more action unfolding. The Jules de Grandin stories were written as serial entertainment, with the legitimate expectation that they would not be read back to back. While all of the adventures are good fun, the best way to properly enjoy them is over an extended period of time. Plowing through one story after another will lessen their impact and greatly cut down on the excitement and fun of reading them. One story a week, which would stretch out this entire 5-volume series over 2 years, might be the perfect amount of time needed to fully enjoy these tales of the occult and the macabre. They might not be great literature, but they don't pretend to be. They're pulp adventures, and even after 75 years, the stories read well. Additionally, though the specific aesthetic values of Weird Tales readers were vastly different than those of today's readers, one can see clearly the continuing allure of these types of supernatural adventures, and the long shadow that they cast over 20th and early 21st century popular culture. Sure, these stories are formulaic, but it is a recipe that continues to be popular to this day. The formula of the occult detective, the protector who stands between us and the monsters of the night, can be seen time and time again in the urban fantasy and paranormal romance categories of commercial fiction, and is prevalent in today's television and movies. Given the ubiquity and contemporary popularity of this type of narrative, it's actually not at all surprising that Seabury Quinn was the most popular contributor to Weird Tales. Finally, if Seabury Quinn is watching from above and closely scrutinizing the shelves of bookstores, he would undoubtedly be pleased as punch and proud as all get out to find his creation, Dr. Jules de Grandin, rising once again in the minds of readers around the world, battling the forces of darkness, wherever, whoever, or whatever the nature of their evil might be. When the jaws of darkness open, only Jules de Grandin stands in Satan's way. Robert E. Weinberg, Chicago, Illinois, USA. And George A. Vanderburg, Lake Eugenia, Ontario, Canada. 23rd of September, 2016. Jules de Grandin, The Pillar of Weird Tales, by Darrell Schweitzer. For someone who played such an important role in the magazine's heyday, there is surprisingly little information about Seabury Quinn and his behind-the-scenes relationship with Weird Tales. Author and pulp magazine contributor E. Hoffman Price, among the memoirs in his Book of the Dead, Arkham House, 2001, profiles Quinn, but doesn't say much about him in connection to Weird Tales. Price also profiles W.T. editor Farnsworth Wright, but doesn't mention Quinn. Price could be an insightful biographer, and he esteemed both men highly, but given that Price regarded pulp writing as purely a trade, something done for the money, the same as carpentry or bricklaying, it isn't surprising that he skimps on the working details, which to him were unimportant. It is clear enough that Quinn, who lived in Brooklyn until mid-1937, when he lost his job as editor of the mortician's journal Casket and Sunnyside and moved to Washington, D.C., was not a member of Wright's social circle. The Weird Tales office was in Chicago, so Quinn could hardly have been one of the Varnished Vultures, an informal club of writers, editors, and artists associated with the magazine who regularly met in Wright's apartment. Price was a member, or someone who stopped by on occasion to help read manuscripts. To my knowledge, Wright and Quinn never met. At least I've yet to find someone who can confirm they did. We do know that Quinn met H.P. Lovecraft on several occasions when Lovecraft was visiting New York. Lovecraft thought well of him, but not of his work, and it is not hard to find comments about him in the various volumes of Lovecraft's letters. For example, H.P.L. wrote the following to author J. Vernon Shea on July 30th, 1931. I met Quinn twice during my stay in New York and find him exceedingly intelligent and likable. He is 44 years old, but looks rather less than that, increasingly stocky, dark, with a closely clipped mustache. He is first of all a shrewd businessman, and freely affirms that he manufactures hokum to order for market demands, in contrast to the artist, who seeks sincere expression as the result of an obscure inward necessity. This was not the only time Lovecraft spoke poorly of Quinn's contributions to the magazine. To author Robert Bloch he wrote, in mid-November 1934, that De Grandin is merely a puppet molded according to cheap popular demand. He represents nothing of Quinn. To writer Natalie H. Woodley on November 22, 1934, he bemoaned the devolution of various writers, including Quinn, Price, Edmund Hamilton, A. Merritt, and many others, who succumbed to the insidious cheapness of the pulp magazine tradition, so that they lost their status as sincere writers and came across as mere herd caterers. And again to Block on May 9th, 1934, he said, "Quinn also has frankly sold his soul to Mammon, but he could turn out magnificent stuff if he would." And so on in a similar vein. There is no need to quote any more. Since we tend to view the entire Weird Tales scene through a Lovecraftian lens, it has become perceived wisdom over the years that Quinn was a disinterested craftsman who just typed out his stories and sent them in, and Farnsworth Wright bought them like yard goods. No interaction, just pure business. What's wrong with this picture is that it is not entirely true. It is not even mostly true. Fortunately, we do get a glimpse from Quinn's point of view in a series of letters he wrote to the artist Virgil Finlay between January and October of 1937. This correspondence takes up 32 pages in Fantasy Collector's Annual 1975, edited and published by Jerry de la Rey. The personality revealed in the letters is not quite what we'd expect from the dignified figure we see in the few surviving photos of Quinn. He is informal, slangy, maybe even a little pushy. He uses words like feller and signs himself with his initials, always drawing little smiley faces inside the Q. He also has a fairly large ego. The correspondence is prefaced with a letter from Quinn to Farnsworth Wright, in which he extols the virtues of the Globe of Memories, one of his first non-de Grandin stories during the period in which he took a brief vacation from the mercurial Frenchman's adventures, in no uncertain terms. Dear Wright, Ambrose Bierce might have written the Globe of Memories, but he didn't. I did. He then asks that Finlay be allowed to illustrate it, at which point his correspondence with Finlay ensues. The letters are full of revelations about Quinn, Weird Tales, and de Grandin. For all Quinn claims, because of my inability to visualize my characters as pictures, I don't really know what de Grandin looks like. He most definitely does know, and later includes a drawing that looks like it was cut from a comic strip to specify exactly what his hero looks like, down to the right kind of mustache. Needle, not fishhook. In fact, Finlay eventually found Quinn a little irritating and a micromanager. Sometimes Quinn says that Finlay should follow his own imagination, but at other times he is specifying how many people are in a scene, in what poses, with what costumes, etc. What is very clear from these letters from the author is that de Grandin is more than the puppet Lovecraft supposed, caring quite a bit for how his characters were portrayed. Of course, Quinn did make a substantial amount of money from the adventures of de Grandin and Trowbridge. For that reason, if no other, I should be fond of them, he writes. But my liking goes deeper. I really regard them as personal friends, and it's sometimes a shock to me to realize that there is no Harrisonville, New Jersey, no Dr. Samuel Trowbridge, no Jules de Grandin. That doesn't sound like a mere hack writer, does it? Quinn was very pleased with the portraits of de Grandin and Trowbridge that Finlay produced, which were used as a standard feature for most of the pair's later appearances in Weird Tales. He also acquired some of Finlay's cover paintings and decorated his office with them. These he received from Wright as gifts, since in those days pulp artists sold their work to publishers outright, never imagining it would have any resale value. We learn some other intriguing details. While there is no evidence that Wright ever asked for revisions or worked with Quinn on the content of the de Grandin stories very much, we do learn that Frozen Beauty was originally entitled The Snow Queen, presumably as an allusion to the fairy tale. Wright changed that. He thought it was too highbrow. In one of the earlier letters, Quinn expresses more than passing interest in Weird Tales itself, repeating to Finlay in detail what he must have previously written to Wright. He wanted to redesign the magazine entirely, transforming it into a quality digest on semi-glossy paper like Coronet or Reader's Digest, which would appeal to a more general audience. He had very exact ideas about what kinds of art should be used, how they should be placed, etc. There's no record of how Wright responded. but in any case most of Quinn's suggestions came to nothing. Weird Tales remained a pulp, its appearance, largely thanks to Finlay, steadily improving in the late 30s, but another of Quinn's ideas did come to fruition. It was he who suggested to Wright that Finlay should be given a full page each issue to illustrate a scene or image from famous fantastic or weird poems. Finlay's poetry page soon became one of the most popular features in Weird Tales. Of course, one of the reasons Weird Tales never transcended the pulp category was lack of money. Quinn was fully aware of the privations the magazine had suffered in the depths of the Depression. It was, he explained to Finlay, who was younger and had not been involved with the magazine at the time, a minor miracle that Wright and his associates were able to keep Weird Tales going at all. How Weird Tales survived this crisis is a particularly dramatic story, which Quinn didn't tell Finlay. The details were only discovered recently and described in an essay by scholar Scott Connors, Weird Tales and the Great Depression, which was published in the Robert E. Howard Reader, an anthology I edited in 2010. It seems that, in order to pay printing bills as the magazine was struggling to establish itself, publisher J.C. Henneberger sold the majority interest in Weird Tales to the printer, one B. Cornelius. The understanding was that once the magazine became profitable, Cornelius would be repaid and he would return the stock to Henneberger. Then the Depression hit. But believing the claims of then-President Herbert Hoover that prosperity was just around the corner, Henneberger and his editor, Farnsworth Wright, instead decided to double down, launching a companion magazine, Oriental Stories, with its first issue dated October-November 1930. Customarily, distributors held back payments for 3 issues of a magazine, and so they wouldn't pay for any sales of Oriental Stories until a 4th issue was delivered. Until that 4th issue, Weird Tales would have to earn enough to support both itself and Oriental. Cornelius, the printer who had been sold a majority interest in Weird Tales, had been patient. Depression-era pulp printers often had to run on credit, because otherwise they might have nothing to print and not even the promise of income, and would have to let their employees go. But enough was enough, and sometime in late 1931, Cornelius ordered Henneberger and Wright to shut Weird Tales down. That could very well have been the end of the magazine, except that Wright was able to convince Cornelius that he had in inventory 2 serials strong enough to save the magazine. One was Tam, Son of Tiger, an imitation Tarzan novel by Otis Adelbert Klein, which in theory could draw some buyers away from Argosy, where that sort of thing usually happened. The other was The Devil's Bride by Seabury Quinn, easily the longest Jules de Grandin story ever written, which was ultimately stretched out over 6 issues, February to July 1932. In Quinn's story was something reliably popular enough to keep Weird Tales going, and it eventually did make it through, if only barely, to the other side of the Great Depression. When you consider that Robert E. Howard still had his best Weird Tales material in front of him, the first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, appeared in the December 1932 issue, and that all of the Weird Tales work of C.L. Moore, Robert Bloch, and many others was yet to come, it is worth pausing to reflect on how much fantastic literature owes to Seabury Quinn's excitable Frenchman. The Devil's Bride is, of course, quintessential pulp fiction. Here Quinn pulls out all the stops. Yet another imperiled society girl, a standby in the de Grandin series, is kidnapped at her wedding rehearsal by a truly fiendish cult of Yazidis, Satanists, communists, and who knows what else. There ensue gory murders, a raid on a black mass, and at the climax, a police and army raid on an even larger cult orgy in West Africa, which is conducted with such violence that it makes Inspector Legrasse's adventure in the Louisiana swamp from Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu look like the issuance of a parking ticket. Don't forget the family curse. The girl in question is the descendant of a Yazidi promised to Satan. A family heirloom, a bridal girdle, is partially composed of human skin. Various young ladies end up unclad throughout the course of the story. Quinn certainly knew how to get his tales featured on the covers of Weird Tales, which in this period almost always featured nudes. What more could any pulp reader want? The Devil's Bride is lurid as all...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?